The first thing I want you to understand is the feeling, because if you don't feel it, the rest of this story won't land. It was broad daylight, the kind of sharp, unforgiving noon sun that makes everything look exposed and vulnerable, and I remember thinking how strange it was that my stomach felt like it was midnight. I was standing in my kitchen, coffee still steaming in my mug, when I glanced out the front window and saw them. 5 HOA inspectors, clipboards in hand, standing stiffly at my gate like a firing squad, and just behind them, slightly apart, a man in a dark suit with a leather briefcase and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A lawyer. At my gate. On my property. And in that instant, before logic could catch up, before calm could negotiate with reason, my heart made a decision my brain hadn't approved yet. I grabbed my shotgun first. Not because I wanted violence, not because I planned to use it, but because fear and anger sometimes move faster than thought, and because in that moment, I felt like an animal being cornered in the open. Now, let me slow this down because this didn't start at my gate. This started months earlier, under the same sun, in the same neighborhood, with rules that were supposed to keep things tidy and fair, but somehow always seemed to land hardest on the same people. I bought my house for peace. I wanted quiet mornings, daylight hours filled with work on my land, and evenings where the only thing knocking was the wind. The HOA sold itself as community standards, but what it became was surveillance disguised as order. Notes on my door about grass height measured to the inch, emails about the color of my fence, which had been the same color when I moved in, warnings about a shed that had stood there longer than half the board members had lived in the neighborhood. Each message was polite on the surface, but underneath it was a pressure, a reminder that someone was watching and waiting for me to slip. I tried to be reasonable at first. I attended meetings, I asked questions, I smiled and nodded while people who had never built anything with their own hands told me how my property should look. Every time I spoke, I could feel the room stiffen, like I had broken an unspoken rule by not agreeing fast enough. Over time, the notices escalated. Warnings turned into fines, fines turned into threats, and always they came during the day when the sun made everything feel public, like my private life was on display for inspection. The day before they showed up with the lawyer, I received an email marked Final Notice. The language was cold and precise, the kind of writing that pretends to be neutral while sharpening the blade. They claimed I was in ongoing violation and that further action would be taken. No specifics beyond what I'd already addressed, no room for discussion. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was scared of losing money, but because I was tired of being pushed. There's a point where compliance stops feeling like cooperation and starts feeling like surrender. So when I saw them at my gate the next day, that exhaustion turned into something heavier. I picked up the shotgun from where it was secured, more as a reflex than a plan, and held it low, not pointed, not threatening, just present. I didn't load it, I didn't rack it, I didn't do anything dramatic. I set it against the wall by the door and took a breath. The presence of it steadied me, not because of what it could do, but because it reminded me that this was my home, my ground, and I had a right to feel safe in it. I stepped outside into the glare of the sun, closed the door behind me, and walked toward the gate. The inspectors stopped talking when they saw me. The lawyer's smile tightened. I could feel every eye on me, and I realized then that they expected me to fold, to apologize, to accept whatever paper they were about to hand me. Instead, I asked a simple question, calm and clear. Why are you on my property without an appointment? It wasn't a challenge. It was a line in the sand. They launched into rehearsed explanations about authority and bylaws, about how they had the right to inspect, how the lawyer was there to facilitate compliance. The words washed over me, and as they spoke, something clicked. They were used to control, but they were sloppy with details. They assumed I didn't know the rules as well as they did. They assumed fear would do the work for them. That assumption was their mistake. I told them they were trespassing. I told them any further communication would be documented. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply stated facts and watched as uncertainty flickered across a few faces. The lawyer tried to regain ground, stepping forward, waving a document, but I didn't take it. I told him to leave it at the gate or mail it.
Boundaries are powerful when you enforce them calmly. They left eventually, not because I scared them, but because daylight exposes arrogance as clearly as it exposes vulnerability. When the gate closed behind them, I felt the adrenaline drain out of me, leaving behind a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I went back inside, put the shotgun away, and sat at my table with a notebook. This was the moment where most people would call a lawyer, beg for help, hand their fight over to someone else. I decided I wouldn't, not because I didn't believe in legal help, but because this wasn't just a legal problem. It was a personal one. Over the next few weeks, I documented everything, every inspection they conducted in the neighborhood, every violation they ignored for board members and friends, every inconsistency, every selective enforcement. I took notes in daylight, photographs with timestamps, recordings of public meetings where rules were bent and twisted. I spoke to neighbors quietly during daytime walks, over fences and driveways, listening more than talking. Stories spilled out once people realized they weren't alone. Fines waived for some, doubled for others. Warnings ignored when it suited the board. Fear kept most people quiet, but anger is contagious when it finally gets air. I never raised my voice at a meeting. I never accused anyone outright. Instead, I asked questions. I requested clarifications. I cited bylaws word for word. I could see the irritation building, the way control slips when it's forced to explain itself. The lawyer stopped showing up, inspectors became cautious, and still the pressure remained, subtle but constant, like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. The turning point came on another bright afternoon, at a community meeting held in a sunlit room with big windows and uncomfortable chairs. I stood up during open comments and calmly laid out my findings. I didn't editorialize, I didn't insult. I simply read dates, amounts, and sections of the rules. I watched faces change as people recognized their own experiences in my words. I watched the board members shift, whisper, sweat under the lights. That day didn't end the HOA's behavior overnight, but it cracked something open. Neighbors started pushing back, committees formed, elections were called. The board lost its grip not because of a single dramatic act, but because daylight, truth, and persistence are harder to fight than fear. Looking back, that moment at the gate with 5 inspectors and a lawyer could have gone very differently. It could have turned ugly. It could have turned quiet and submissive. Instead, it became the spark for a kind of revenge that didn't require violence or outside saviors. The revenge was taking back dignity. It was forcing accountability. It was standing firm in the sun and refusing to be bullied on my own land. I tell you this not to glorify confrontation, but to remind you that power often relies on the assumption that you won't push back. Sometimes the most suspenseful battles happen in broad daylight, not with weapons, but with patience, preparation, and the courage to say no. And sometimes the moment you think you're about to lose everything is the moment you realize you're finally ready to defend what matters, not with force, but with resolve.
I remember walking home from that meeting under the same hard daylight, the sun sitting high like an unblinking eye, and for the first time in months, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not victory, but momentum. That's a dangerous thing if you don't control it. Momentum can push you into mistakes. I told myself over and over that whatever I did next had to be deliberate, calm, and clean. The HOA expected me to explode or back down. What they didn't expect was patience sharpened into purpose. The days that followed were strange. Inspectors still drove past my house in the middle of the day, slow enough to be obvious, but they no longer stopped. I could feel their eyes on my property, measuring, judging, waiting. Every time a car slowed near my gate, my pulse jumped, but I forced myself to stay steady. Fear is loud if you listen to it too closely. I focused instead on patterns. Who showed up? When? How long they stayed? Who they talked to afterward? I noticed something important in that daylight watching. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were creating pressure, hoping I'd either pay quietly or make a mistake they could use. They relied on the assumption that most people didn't have the time or energy to fight back. That assumption was their second mistake. One afternoon, as the sun cast sharp shadows along the fence line, I saw 2 inspectors measuring a neighbor's yard across the street.
This neighbor had confided in me weeks earlier, voice low, eyes darting, about fines that seemed to come out of nowhere. I walked over calmly, not angry, not aggressive, just present. I stood where they could see me clearly and asked polite questions about what they were measuring and why. The inspectors stiffened. They weren't used to witnesses. Daylight has a way of turning quiet intimidation into public discomfort. They quoted rules. I quoted them back, word for word. I watched one of them blink, confused, then annoyed. They packed up faster than they had arrived. My neighbor looked at me like I'd just done something dangerous. I told him softly that rules only work one way when people are isolated. Together, they have to behave. That was the day I realized revenge didn't have to be loud. It could be slow. It could be systematic. It could make them feel exactly what they'd made others feel for years, watched, exposed, and uncertain. I began attending every HOA meeting held during daylight hours, sitting in the front row. I asked for financial breakdowns. I requested written explanations for enforcement decisions. I followed up in emails and copied other homeowners, always polite, always calm. Every response they gave became another thread to pull. I could see the stress in the board members' faces, the way smiles cracked when daylight streamed through the windows and reflected off their paperwork. Secrets don't like the sun. Then came the retaliation, subtle but unmistakable. Another violation notice appeared in my mailbox one afternoon, the paper warm from the sun. Different wording, same intent. This time they claimed a safety concern with my fence. I knew it was nonsense. The fence had passed inspections before. They were testing me, seeing if I'd flinch. Instead of responding immediately, I waited. That waiting drove them crazy. I could tell because inspectors started showing up again, lingering at the gate, talking loudly, making sure I noticed. One even took photos in plain sight, standing in the open, like he wanted me to react. I didn't. I worked in my yard under the sun, slow and methodical, letting them photograph a man who wasn't afraid of being seen. When I finally responded, I did it publicly. I requested a walkthrough inspection with written criteria, scheduled at a time when neighbors would be home. Daytime, always daytime. They couldn't refuse without exposing themselves, so they agreed. The day of the inspection felt heavier than it should have. The sky was clear, the air hot, the kind of day where everything feels sharper. Neighbors drifted outside, pretending to water plants or check mail. The inspectors arrived with forced smiles. No lawyer this time. That absence told me everything. We walked the property slowly. Every measurement was questioned. Every note was clarified. When they contradicted themselves, I asked them to repeat it for the record. I could see the frustration building, the control slipping. This wasn't the easy compliance they were used to. This was work. By the end, they had nothing. No violation that could stand scrutiny. They left stiffly, knowing they'd lost this round. What they didn't know was that the real revenge was still unfolding. Over the next month, homeowners started reaching out to me directly, in daylight conversations, in driveways, at mailboxes. I never told them what to do. I simply showed them how to document, how to question, how to stay calm. Fear dissolved when people realized knowledge was contagious. The HOA's power began to fracture, not because of a single act of defiance, but because too many eyes were now watching. The final confrontation came on a bright afternoon at a special meeting called to address community concerns. The room was packed, sunlight pouring through the windows, illuminating every nervous twitch, every bead of sweat. I spoke last. I laid out the pattern, not accusations, evidence, dates, comparisons. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. The board tried to dismiss it, but the room had changed. People weren't afraid anymore. Questions came from every direction, demands for audits, calls for resignations. The board members looked smaller under the light, stripped of the shadows they'd hidden in for years. I didn't smile. Revenge isn't about joy. It's about balance. I watched as control slipped away from people who had abused it, not because I threatened them, but because I refused to be silent. When I walked home that day, the sun still high, my gate stood open, unguarded. No inspectors, no lawyer, just quiet. I knew then that the moment I'd grabbed the shotgun wasn't about violence at all. It was the moment I decided I wouldn't be pushed anymore. The real weapon had been resolution, sharpened by daylight, and aimed not at people, but at fear itself. And that's how I took my revenge. Not with force, not with authorities riding in to save me, but by standing my ground, making everything visible, and turning their own rules into the spotlight they couldn't escape. I thought the story was over after that meeting, and for a few quiet days it felt like it. The sun kept rising, the neighborhood settled into an uneasy calm, and no inspectors showed up at my gate. But real revenge doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It lingers, it waits, and the HOA, wounded and embarrassed, wasn't done trying to remind me who they thought was in charge. It started with silence, which can be louder than threats. Emails stopped, notices stopped, even the usual slow patrol drives disappeared. At first, neighbors celebrated quietly, but I knew better. Organizations like that don't let go easily. They regroup, they look for a cleaner angle. One afternoon, with the sun glaring straight down and heat shimmering off the pavement, I saw the HOA president standing at the edge of my property line. No clipboard this time, no inspectors, just him alone, pretending to take a phone call while staring at my fence. I walked out calmly and stood a few feet away, close enough that he couldn't ignore me. He smiled thinly and said something about checking in, about how things had gotten out of hand. I listened without interrupting, letting the daylight expose how uncomfortable he was without backup. Then I told him quietly and clearly that everything he said from that point on would be written down and shared publicly. I watched his smile falter. Control hates witnesses. That same week, I received a notice about a special assessment. Every homeowner did. The explanation was vague, buried in jargon, but I understood immediately what it was meant to do. Punish the whole community so resentment would turn back towards me. It was clever, I'll give them that, but clever isn't the same as smart. Instead of reacting emotionally, I went door to door in the daytime when people were awake, alert, and willing to talk. I brought copies of budgets, meeting notes, and timelines. I didn't accuse, I explained. I showed how the assessment tied back to legal fees, consultant costs, and failed enforcement actions. I could see the anger replacing fear in people's eyes. That transformation is powerful. It's irreversible. Within days, the HOA inbox flooded with challenges, requests for justification, demands for votes, calls for transparency. They tried to stall, to delay, but daylight works against secrecy. The more they resisted, the more obvious it became that something was wrong. The final confrontation came on a cloudless afternoon at what was supposed to be a routine vote. The room was packed again, sunlight pouring in, highlighting every tired face. I hadn't planned to speak, but when the HOA president stood up and tried to frame the assessment as necessary and unavoidable, I knew it was time. I stood slowly. My hands weren't shaking, my voice didn't waver. I laid out everything. The selective enforcement, the retaliatory inspections, the cost of intimidation disguised as governance. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told the truth and let it sit in the open air. Then something happened I didn't expect. One of the inspectors, the same one who had stood at my gate weeks earlier, stood up. In broad daylight, in front of everyone, he admitted they'd been instructed to focus on certain homes more than others. The room went silent. That confession was the last brick pulled from a wall already cracking. Votes were called, motions passed, board members resigned on the spot. The assessment was scrapped. An interim committee was formed, made up of homeowners who never wanted power in the first place, only fairness. When I walked home that day, the sun felt warmer, less harsh. My gate stood exactly as it always had, but it felt different. It felt like a boundary that had been respected, not challenged. I thought back to that first moment, standing in my kitchen, seeing 5 inspectors and a lawyer at my gate, my heart racing as I grabbed the shotgun out of instinct and fear.